Hey there YouTube, I'm Yukitsu, this is the Yukitsu Times, welcome to my channel, welcome to Amnesia Rebirth in Retrospective. So this is a difficult review to do, but I'm going to just dive straight into it there. Starting off with things I don't care too much about there, but first of all, let's talk about the graphics. This is by far the most technically advanced of the Amnesia games, which can be expected. It takes a long time for each of the games to come out there. They have a big delay between each of them, so just the technology has advanced a lot since the original Amnesia game came out, Amnesia Dark Descent. However, in spite of the fact that they're still a relatively small studio by comparison to a lot of them out there, this is actually a fairly competent game in terms of just the graphical fidelity and stuff like that. It's not going to match the big first-person shooters out there, but it's not super far behind in terms of the graphics and the appearance of it. So I do think that they did a really good job there. Now, there are some purists in the horror sort of genre who will say that games, especially horror games, work better when they've got these constrained budgets and limited technological capabilities, but I don't necessarily think that's true. An example of people who would say that are the ones that say the technical limitations are what made Silent Hill's atmosphere so iconic. And while it is true that the fog is there because of technical limitations, they could still have used those mechanisms in a game that had like long draw distances, were capable of showing you a lot there. And sort of the proof of that is that Amnesia Rebirth has got these scenes where you can see far off into the distance. You can see things that are going to pop up in like interactable things that are quite distant from you, and there's nothing interfering with seeing those. But at the same time, they also have a lot of these very tight corridors that in another game would be used to sort of limit the amount of stuff that they have to render at a time. They use very heavy fog effects in certain parts of the alien otherworld, making it almost impossible to see a few feet ahead of you, but you can still see dimly through the fog distant points that you can see. And so it's clear that they're capable of using those sort of mechanics while still having those higher graphical elements. And it really just comes down to a matter of whether or not the studio is willing to put in the effort and the creativity to make their game have that atmosphere in spite of the fact that they don't have to. And I think Amnesia Rebirth does a really good job of having the ability to make things look good when they want to. They're capable of making large open areas if they want to, while still having that tense claustrophobic atmosphere that other games have whenever they want to have that. They do a really sort of good job of using limited field of view because of caves, because of darkness, because of fog. All of those come into play in this game in a way that makes it very tense and very difficult to feel relaxed about where you are. So I don't think that technical limitations necessarily make for better horror games. I do think that it's just whether or not a design team feels motivated to have that atmosphere in their horror game. And in this case, they definitely did. And a lot of those design decisions really sort of accentuates the horror of the game, the atmosphere of the game. In other parts of the design, there's the aesthetic choices. I do think that they did a fairly good job of this. There's a much more varied terrain set than in previous games. It creates a much better visual sort of interest curve if you compare it to Amnesia Dark Descent. Amnesia Dark Descent suffers from it all being those sort of gray corridors and that big oppressive castle. That's pretty much the entire setting. Amnesia Machine for Pigs goes through a couple changes before sort of settling into that sort of rusted industrial sort of look there. Soma sort of alternates between the interior corridors of the science facilities as well as the outside into the water, and they do a pretty good job in Soma of varying it between those ones. This one expands upon that even further again. They've just been getting better and better at incorporating more environments and more different types of aesthetics into their games. This one goes from the sort of sweeping vast deserts to these very close, tight caves to these very alien landscapes. They've even got a few places with vegetation, which are quite rare for their games. They just go through a much more interesting set of different places. None of them really feel like they speak to me on an individual level as being this place is really amazing, but that's usually because I'm not focusing too much on the aesthetics of a place. It's pretty good at making me feel more focused on trying to get through where I'm trying to go instead of spending too much time looking at where I am in terms of the aesthetics. But when I do, it's usually actually pretty nice. They've got very beautiful vistas of looking at the sunset, or they've got these very pristine-looking villages and towns, or forts, I guess is what they actually are, that have a lot going on visually. And I think that they do a really good job of making sure that everywhere that you go does actually have some interesting elements to it. The aesthetic design as well of the characters, they look very, very mundane, but they also look distinct from one another, the few ones that you run into that are still human-ish. Everything looks very grounded and very realistic. It helps a lot with what they were trying to go for, which is making it a very immersive game where you feel like you're sort of very integrated into the game's world and narrative. And the fact that everyone looks very realistic while still looking individual makes the game much more immersive in that sort of way there. And in spite of that, they're still capable, clearly, of making fantastical, very interesting-looking characters. I do think that the more grounded characters look a lot less visually interesting, but they've also got these characters that are much more fantastical, like the Empress, who I think her outfit design is just really, really good. I wish you could steal that outfit when you were visiting that place. The way they've designed the hunters in this one, much better than Amnesia Dark Descent. It just looks like they've grown a lot as a studio in terms of being able to design characters and make them look the way that they want them to and have the effect that they want them to, and they put a lot more thought, I think, into the effect that they want those to have. I think if you go back and play Amnesia Dark Descent, look at the monsters, they don't really fulfill the purpose I think that they're supposed to, whereas the ones in Amnesia Rebirth, the hunters, for example, even if you get a good look at them, they don't stop being intimidating because they don't look like they're made out of rubber that's melting. Like the monster in Amnesia Dark Descent looks like a Stretch Armstrong that's been left in an oven for a few minutes. It doesn't look that intimidating, honestly. But these guys, they still do. Although admittedly, they look a little bit like those pictures, that picture from the Russian sleep experiment creepypasta, which wasn't a very good story, but it was a creepy picture. So I do think that they did a great job in terms of the visuals for the type of game that it is. If you're expecting, like, the new Crysis or whatever to benchmark your PC with, this is not that game, but there's only a few horror games, even in AAA, that I think actually look better than this, and those would be things like the Resident Evil series and the Evil Within games. Like, those ones are kind of the only ones that I feel look dramatically better than this. And that's quite impressive for what is ostensibly still kind of an indie game. Moving on to the sound, this is where we get into territory that's a little bit more disappointing. First of all, the music. The music does exactly what you expect it to and what you want it to. There's nothing spectacular about it, but there's nothing detracting about it either. It's the kind of music in a horror game that sits in the background and just does its thing. And it adds to the ambience and terror and the tension and stuff like that. But there's no really great emotional songs like there are in some other series, like, say, Silent Hill has really, really good music. I wish that more horror games did have those sort of really iconic, great soundtrack songs like Silent Hill, but it's pretty rare for that to happen. In any event, you don't want those sort of songs coming to the forefront of the game very often anyhow. What you really want is what it does in this game, which is just sit in the background, add to the ambience a little bit, and it does a very passable job, and it does a very good job at that sort of thing in this game. The sound effects, on the other hand, I feel are very outdated. Like, I was going through quite a few of the parts where I'm just thinking, this sounds exactly like it did in Amnesia Dark Descent to me, just from my memory of it. I'd have to do a direct side-by-side comparison to say for sure, but the impression that I get is definitely that the sound effects are a lot more outdated than some of the other elements of the game design. The sound of, for example, crumbling rocks never felt very present. It always felt like this sort of distant rumbling, even if it's something cracking right in front of your feet there. The sound of the matches being struck and stuff like that, other sound effects, like the monsters scampering around didn't really sound like much. They could have done a lot more in the sound effects department, and that was the only real element, technically, that I think they could have done a dramatically better job on. I think it's just that they've been using the same sound effects for all this time and haven't really updated them in a dramatic way when they probably should, to a certain extent there. Now, the last element of sound is the voice acting, and the voice acting has improved a ton compared to the other games. This is by far the best vocal performance of all the games in the Amnesia series. I did like them in Soma, and I thought that the over-dramatic performance in A Machine for Pigs was a lot of fun, and was also well done. But this one is by far the most realistic voice acting. It's the most immersive voice acting. It didn't feel overacted like in the other ones, because even in Soma, I feel like the voice acting is a little bit overacted and a little bit artificial sounding. This one sounds very natural. All the accents sound good, even if someone told me that the accents are not quite right there, that's not what's important. What's important is that it makes you feel as though it's probably right. And it does a really, really good job of getting it close enough that you can't really tell if you're a casual listener. And because of that, it feels more like it's real. It doesn't feel like it's acted. It doesn't feel like it's a parody of that sort of nationality there. Of course, someone who spoke those languages and knows the accent better than a non-native speaker, of course, would disagree with the latter part there. But it works well in the framework of the game, and I think they do a really good job of the voice acting. I hope that if they do another one, this is the part that I think they really stepped up to the plate on for Amnesia Rebirth and needs to carry over in for future games. So moving away from there, let's talk a little bit about the gameplay. So in terms of gameplay, Amnesia Rebirth is the biggest return to form to Amnesia Dark Descent out of the series. It has a lot of those sort of same puzzles that you would have seen in Amnesia Dark Descent, where you're doing physics puzzles to try and move objects to cause a change to the environment, like rolling a cannon over a weak spot in the floor so that breaks through it, and you need to sort of collect all the little wheels for that, or you need to collect all the different chemicals to do a chemistry thing to make a shell, or you need to do a bunch of pulleys to move blocks so that you can crawl across them and get through a tunnel. All of that feels very, very similar to the way that Amnesia Dark Descent played, and for my part, I don't really care if it's in there, and I don't mind if it's in there in any sort of way. So from my perspective, what this sort of stuff does is it encourages the player and forces the player to go around the stage looking through dark corners where they might get scared of things, or where there's high tension because they feel like they might have something happen to them. And that really ramps up that sort of tension and that sort of scary atmosphere to the game. For a player like me, where I'm usually looking for notes and other things to try and figure out what the story is, it's not necessary to include these puzzle elements, but I'm already going through all those parts of the game anyhow, so I don't mind these. They feel like they're sometimes a little bit like just padding, but they're padding that I don't necessarily mind doing. They often feel rewarding to accomplish, but at the same time, if you remove them from the game, I'm not really offended by it either, so I'm kind of neutral on the inclusion of these sort of things. If you're the sort of person, though, who liked Amnesia Dark Descent and missed those elements, this is definitely a return to form for those players. In terms of new mechanics, this one introduces a couple. The first one I want to talk about is the running sections. So this game has a bunch of sections that are nearly cinematic scenes, where all you do is hit down the shift key and you run from point A to point B down a corridor where you're basically channeled and funneled down the correct path by a bunch of visual cues up ahead of you. And this is much more interesting than just a cutscene of you running. This is much more interesting than just a QuickTime event. I do think that these moments, even though all you're doing is hitting the W key, the shift key, and then turning your mouse occasionally, is actually a pretty good addition to the game. I think that these feel quite tense, quite scary, quite stressful, and in the moment you don't realize just how simple of a scene it really is. However, I do think that this game overuses this mechanic, making it so that you're doing this far, far too often. I think that this was one of the ones where every time you do it, the stress of it and the intensity of it sort of gets peeled a little bit away every time you do it. I think that this game does suffer a little bit as a result of that, but not very much. I still think that it's a positive mechanic, and I think that they should have included it in the game as they did, but I think that they just needed to use it a little bit less often. How quickly this sort of thing wears off on you is going to vary from player to player, but for me, I think that they definitely used it a little bit too much there. The other major mechanic that they incorporated into the game is the ability to, of course, reduce your stress by checking on your baby. And this is a really fantastic mechanic in a sense there, because it makes you sort of think about something, and it provides a mechanical reason for a player to remind themselves that there's something going on there. Because I think that there is that potential for a lot of players to be playing through it, and if they're the sort of player who doesn't think about that kind of thing, and if it didn't provide a mechanical benefit of reducing your stress, I think there's a lot of players who just wouldn't bother checking, and as a result might not think about it that much, might not have that much of an attachment to that, might not have as much empathy towards that situation. But since even players who are mechanically motivated are being pressed in towards checking on your baby, I think that sort of provides that hit of sort of empathy towards the situation there that might not otherwise exist. For me personally, I don't need the mechanical benefit of it, but I think that being there also does help quite a bit. Just having that mechanic, though, in general, is such a thematic element to the game that I think that is worth mentioning as an interesting addition to the game. Definitely a creative use of the way that video games work that doesn't really fit into any other medium, and I think that makes it just such an interesting thing to do. Feels a little bit Death Stranding-ish, but that's neither here nor there because I haven't played Death Stranding. In any event, though, that's the majority of what you're going to be doing in this game. There are, of course, the sneaking type bits that you get from all of the other horror games in the Amnesia series, including ones like A Machine for Pigs, including ones for like Soma, as well as all of the other ones outside of this franchise. But honestly speaking, I've never been a huge fan of the stealth past monster sections or evade monster sections, because they're never quite as interesting as the other parts of the game. And the worst part of these is that they discourage exploration, because you're sort of forced to spend all your time like running away from things and hiding in corners or cupboards or whatever. Not really my favorite part of the game. I don't think that this game does it any better than any of the other ones, really. But it's there. It's a mainstay staple of the Amnesia series, even into Penumbra. It's just a mechanic that is never going to die, because it provides a sort of reason for you to be afraid of things in a game where you're not capable of fighting back. It's kind of the only way for you to interact with the monsters outside of cutscenes or cutscene-like moments. Now, the last mechanic that I want to talk about is the one that makes those moments a little bit more tense than they would otherwise be, and that is the way that death is handled in Amnesia Rebirth. So in the Amnesia series, the creators have very quickly on identified that getting killed by the monsters is not really that scary. Once you're dead and have died a bunch of times in the game, the threat of death no longer really has as much of an impact on the player. And because of that, it's better to tease the fact that they could have died in this spot than to actually kill them, because like you get killed and you're just like, okay, well, I just come back to life, and you sort of start losing that sense of immersion. In Amnesia Rebirth, you're never killed by the monsters. What happens is you because of the fact that you drank that tainted water or whatever and are slowly becoming a hunter, you're basically immortal, I guess. I'm not entirely sure. But you sort of flip out and gain all this super strength and turn into a frenzied monster. And because you know that there are reasons to try and avoid doing this, there's a lot of moments where it's hinted at that you need to avoid letting that happen to you. You get the impression that you need to not let this happen. And even if it happens to you, you regain control of yourself, and you notice that it gets a little bit harder every time for you to regain control of yourself. And eventually, you look in the water and see that you've become horribly tainted. That element of all that sort of pays off in a way that's much more interesting than just dying and then coming back to life and then redoing it. And I do think that because of that, it's a really interesting mechanic and a good way to make death or getting captured by the enemy or whatever more stressful than it is in other horror games, while not being a great mechanic for every horror game. Like, the reason that this is happening in this game is so tightly interwoven into the narrative of the game that you wouldn't be able to transpose this into just any other horror game. So I do think that this is a unique mechanic that is it works for Amnesia Rebirth only because of how integral it is to the story that's being told, and the sort of mystery around what's happening to you that slowly gets unraveled throughout the story there. Which does segue me into the story of this game. Now, similar to Soma, there are essentially two stories going on in Amnesia Rebirth, and I want to talk about the weaker half of it first. If this was the only story going on, I would not have liked this game very much. It would have been very, very lowly rated. But because it works so well when melded together into the other narrative, the way that they weave into one another, they strengthen each other to make a much, much stronger approach. And while I prefer the second half of the story that I'm going to discuss later, the second half doesn't work without the first half as well. So I do think that this is one of those rare cases where that weak story greatly amplifies a better story to make the whole experience really, really good. So the first story of this game is a little bit August Derleth-y in that it takes a cosmic sort of Cthulhian type of entity, these weird aliens, the orb, the sphere, or whatever, the hunters, the whatever, the shadow, all of these things, and it explains all of them relentlessly. Now, if you paid deep attention to the lore in Amnesia Dark Descent, you're going to feel very, very heavily rewarded by Amnesia Rebirth, because you'll get a ton of additional lore relating to things that you already know. There's lots of callbacks. There's a lot of things that you're going to understand better by having paid attention to Amnesia Dark Descent. But ultimately, there's almost a feeling like you could take this game and use it to just completely fill in a wiki. And this is kind of why I compare it to August Derleth. He basically takes the Call of Cthulhu series, which is supposed to be about the fear of the unknown, and then he explains the ever-loving hell out of it, like who Cthulhu is, what his favorite color is, what his favorite element is, who his brother is, what his mother does on weekends. Like, it's the sort of person who doesn't really understand that stuff being unknowable is the appeal of it. So he creates a very knowable, relatable kind of horror instead, sort of dragging it, kicking and screaming from the unknown into the known by making it just relatable, really. And that's kind of what happens here to the aliens and those other beings, the gatekeepers and stuff like that. They become very thoroughly explored in this game, and I think because of that, I'm just not really that interested in that kind of story. It can work in some contexts. Like, I think that the SCP Foundation, for example, is interesting stories, but I don't think they're scary per se. And I think that they make for sort of fun little kind of vignettes, but they don't make for a good grand narrative, in my opinion. And that's sort of what happens in here, where the big explanation of the aliens is just not that interesting to me. Now, if you are a lore nerd, this game is going to be perfect for you. If you went into Amnesia Dark Descent and you want to know everything about everything, this is the game that you're going to want to play to get that sort of closure about all that information. But for me, that's just not a kind of story that I'm all that interested in. The second story that this game tells is, of course, the story about tazzy. And there's a lot of deeply personal, tragic moments in that particular story that sort of get woven together to create this very complicated, very psychological story about this character that would have been interesting even without, I think, the sort of alien stuff. But the alien amnesia thing is woven together with it in such a way that it really amplifies her personal story as well. The idea about there's so many good scenes that are just related to fears relating to her and her children, like that. The first scene, for example, where you're walking into the room with the crib and Salim and your child both sort of evaporate away and the walls break down and you can see the gigantic sort of fetus out in the distance there. I thought personally that was like oh geez, I can't even remember the name of that. But postpartum depression is what that was representing. And, having gotten through the rest of the game, it's not far off of what she was feeling. It's just, a little bit more of an extreme version of that, I guess. It really is a tragedy that you feel for if you're a certain type of person, and I certainly did. And the scene, of course, where, like, you're unborn child, you know, she's sort of grown up. You see your imagined version of her sitting on the windowsill that sort of sails away, and you're trying to swim towards it as fast as you can, but you can't catch up to it. Like, that's powerful imagery. That's really well done. That shows a kind of anxiety, a kind of like waking nightmare of something that you know is legitimately horrifying, in my opinion. Those sort of elements to me work way better than the story about the aliens and stuff like that. But because of the way that they frame the overall story, the aliens one meshes together with that and creates a story that's much, much, much stronger as a sort of whole narrative, creating different parallels. Because I think there are parallels between the Empress and Tazzy that existed throughout that story that made things very interesting. The conflict between the two at the end being ultimately over the same sort of thing. The fact that the choice at the end there wasn't necessarily between good and evil, although there is, I would argue, an altruistic good ending. It's not necessarily the right ending, and I think that's what's so complicated and great about the way that they do the storytelling at the end there, where you've got to you almost feel going into that you want to solve it not based on what is wrong or right, but what Tassie would want to do given the circumstances. And that's so much more complicated and so much more difficult to decide than just making the best rational decision. And I'm not necessarily even sure that I did. I don't think I did to a certain extent there. But it's such a good story, woven together into a story that isn't necessarily that interesting, but they play off each other so well that I can't disentangle them without it sort of all coming apart. It's fascinating how they've managed to do that. So, in terms of this game, it is also the most direct sequel to Amnesia Dark Descent. So, if you are playing this series for the first time, what I would highly recommend is you play Amnesia Dark Descent, and then you play Amnesia Rebirth. And I would play those two back to back. I would still recommend Amnesia Machine for Pigs, and I would still recommend Soma, but they're not really tied together into the same narrative, to the same story, and they don't do callbacks to each other in the same sort of way. So I definitely feel like these two tie together in the most cohesive sort of way there, and would definitely recommend these two together. Now, in summary, where do I put this game, and who do I recommend it for? So, I actually am having a hard time deciding if this is my second favorite or third favorite in this series. And don't get me wrong, like, the Amnesia series, all 4 games, and I do consider it 4 games, all of them are ones that I really like. Amnesia Dark Descent is the one that I placed at the bottom there. Amnesia Machine for Pigs is in the middle, and then Soma's at the top there. And for me, this is fighting for second place or third place with Machine for Pigs. It's definitely better in terms of the way the game plays, but the narrative is so much more important for me. I definitely am leaning towards saying that this is second. The reason I like Soma more is that it is a much more thought-provoking, much deeper story. While this one is highly emotional and really well done, I do think that there's less to sort of continue thinking about for a long time afterwards. Whereas, you know, this game, I'm not going to necessarily think about the complexity of the storytelling for too long, because it's a good story told well, but there's not a lot of questions that it leaves open, whereas Soma leaves open a lot of really interesting questions that I still think about to this day. So I think that that's the reason that that one sort of is the top one for me. Now, if you're the sort of person who is deep into lore, that's what you play games for, is to collect all the notes, read every single journal entry, try and piece every little bit of information together so that you can compile your Wikipedia article, and explain how everything ties together in your game theory sort of way, then this is going to probably be your favorite Amnesia game, and I would highly, highly recommend that you play Amnesia Dark Descent and then play this one. If you're the sort of person who's just in for that sort of psychological storytelling, I would still say that this is a really, really good one. I definitely would say that it's a little bit less psychological than A Machine for Pigs or Soma, but it's still up there with those ones. It's still pretty close. If you're the sort of person who liked games like Silent Hill 2 as compared to the other ones, then this one's probably going to be pretty your speed. I think that it sort of fills that kind of niche there. And If you're, of course, not into any horror games at all, then this is probably not going to change your mind. If you're not into the Amnesia series, this is not going to change your mind. It is very much the DNA of that sort of Amnesia type horror game genre of games there, where you can't fight anything and just have to run. So I definitely think that this is one of those games where if you haven't tried out the Amnesia series but you do like horror games, don't start with this one, but definitely give it a look, give it a try, because it's a story that's worth listening to and going through. It's a scary game. It's got lots of great moments that are quite creepy. It's got a good atmosphere. It's got a very sort of oppressive sort of feeling to it. And I definitely would say that this is going to be one that you enjoy. Now, if you're one of the people who gets very easily frustrated by areas that are difficult to navigate, and I definitely think that this is going to be some people, because I'm one of these people to a certain extent there. I'm willing to go past it because I liked the story enough that I was willing to go past this. If you get frustrated by navigating through difficult to navigate areas, you dislike not having a map that tells you where to go, you dislike fumbling through the dark where you can't see where you're going or what's going on, this game is going to have some moments that are intensely frustrating to you. They're not scary, they're not stressful, they're just frustrating. They're ones that make you want to sort of throw your mouse at the wall sort of thing rather than anything else. I don't know if I would say that that's necessarily bad game design, because that is, I think, a deliberate choice in terms of having that disorienting, confusing layout to the world. But at the same time, be aware, if you are the sort of person who has trouble with that kind of thing, you are going to have trouble with that here. So that is pretty much everything I have to say about Amnesia Rebirth. Just the fact that there's so many different systems that bounce off each other and are so interlinked with one another, and the narrative makes it a hard game to review when looking at it in parts. You sort of have to look at it as a whole, and I think that it's definitely a game worth checking out. So in any event, hope you found this video enjoyable, and of course, as always, hope to see you guys all next time.